a remote island in the South Atlantic, a battle hundreds of years in the making is underway. Firing the first salvo of war, a dictator gambles with fate, believing a leader halfway around the world will not take on a seemingly unwinnable fight. Underestimating the enemy results in dangerous and deadly consequences. This is the conspiracy behind a bold invasion, a risky counterstrike, the battle for the Falklands. These are the events that shape our world. These are the leaders that risk it all. These are the final moments before war. This is Edge of War.
Conflicts often arise over disputed territory. A piece of land, a waterway, or in the case of the Falklands, a group of islands that two different nations each claim belongs to them. These disputes can last for decades, even centuries, without a single bullet ever being fired. But sometimes a nation's own internal situation can create a flashpoint, a moment when the use of military force suddenly gains appeal. Conquest, after all, can be a diversion, can distract from local problems, and rally national pride. The spoils of war aren't limited to the battlefield, even when that battlefield is an ocean away.
April 2nd, 1982. With dawn still hours away, Argentine Special Ops commandos storm the Falkland Islands. The British overseas territory, comprised of 2 large islands and 778 small islands, is located 290 miles off the southern coast of Argentina and has been contested by Argentinian rulers for over 150 years. Now, a ruthless dictator hopes to distract an angry populace with gun barrel patriotism. As 200 invading Argentine troops advance across the island, one unit rushes to catch the island's 80-soldier British garrison by surprise. Within 4 hours of landing, they breach the exterior of the British barracks. Yet they come up empty-handed. Another key target is Government House, 4 miles away in the capital city of Stanley. A unit of Argentine commandos burst through what they think is the back door, running directly into British resistance.
The Argentine Special Forces mistakenly came in through the door of the servants' quarters, came up against some Royal Marines who shot them.
Suffering the first casualties of the invasion, the Argentine force pulls back to regroup. Then in larger numbers, they surround Government House, trapping inside the island's popular governor, Rex Hunt, Royal Marines Commander Major Mike Norman, and several British Marines. 2 miles further east, 8 Royal Marines are in position to take on a convoy of 18 Argentine Amtraks. Outnumbered and underarmed, the British soldiers are forced to retreat to Stanley. Argentine forces continue arriving, taking up commanding positions around the small capital city, flexing their military muscle. Less than 12 hours later, the Argentine in charge of the invasion, Admiral Carlos Bucer, proclaims victory. Yet the British, despite few options, refuse to give him the honor.
Governor Hunt told me on the radio that Admiral Bucer had asked him to surrender. And Governor Hunt, in true British fashion, said, "No, you have illegally taken British territory, and I order you to leave forthwith." Eventually, the Argentinians did arrive at the radio station. The officer in charge had a whole load of tapes with him, cassette tapes, well prepared in English and Spanish. And they basically said that they'd come to take what belonged to them, and they'd come in peace, and they didn't want bloodshed. People's rights would be observed. And of course, they played the national anthem over and over again, the long version. And, well, I still respect their national anthem, of course, but it does make me cringe every time I hear it, even today.
By 9 a.m., with Argentine soldiers outnumbering Royal Marines by more than 10 to 1, Governor Hunt realizes that further resistance is futile. To save lives, he tells Major Norman to give the order. The Royal Marines are to lay down their weapons.
Photographs were taken of the British Royal Marines lying on the road with their hands behind their heads. And of course, these were quite humiliating. These photographs went all around the world.
As Government House surrenders, Governor Rex Hunt presents himself, refusing to shake the hand of the invading commander. Victorious, the Argentine flag is raised in Stanley, and Brigadier General Mario Menendez is appointed the governor of the newly renamed Islas Malvinas. Back in Argentina, news that their invasion is a resounding success reaches President Leopoldo Galtieri and Admiral Jorge Anaya. As they plan, the capture of the long-coveted islands ignites a wave of nationalism, celebration, and support for their regime.
I was a young kid. I remember walking by the street and hearing all these honks, all these cars, people cheering, flags, and all that. I was completely caught by surprise and I said, what's going on? And someone said, we got the Malvinas.
Si quieren venir, que vengan, les presentaremos batalla.
The reaction is drastically different 8,000 miles away in the United Kingdom. Reeling from the news, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher wastes no time denouncing the hostile invasion. In an emergency meeting, she turns to Navy Chief Henry Leach for advice.
Well, Margaret Thatcher said to Admiral Sir Henry Leach, why should we do this? And he said, we must do this, because if we don't, no one will ever trust us again. The country will never be the same again, and we will be abandoning the islanders to a regime which has murdered thousands of its own people.
It's all Thatcher needs to hear.
The photographing of the Royal Marines as prisoners of war was international humiliation. There was no way Great Britain was going to give up the Falklands any more than it was going to give up Belize to the Guatemalans. And therefore, Margaret Thatcher had an option of sending a task force to recover the islands.
It's a risky operation with little chance for success, yet it's one she has no choice but to take. Daunting orders to launch a mission half a world away have already reached Commander Julian Thompson.
4 o'clock in the morning on Friday the 2nd of April, the phone by my bed rang. General Jeremy Moore was on the other end, and because it was an open line, he spoke cryptically, saying, bring your people to short notice, load and sail south. The main problem was there was no contingency plan to retake the Falkland Islands in the event of an Argentine invasion, because the Ministry of Defence had done a study some months previously which concluded that doing so was quite impossible. So my naval colleague, Mike Clapp, and I were invited to open a box labelled impossible and make it happen.
April 5th, just 3 days after the initial invasion, thousands of Royal Marine commandos and paratroopers leave Portsmouth on board frigates, destroyers, aircraft carriers, and troop ships, heading for the distant Falkland Islands, destined for war. A war much of the world thinks they cannot possibly win.
In early 1982, the population of Argentina is restless. Not only have they endured 5 years of harsh dictatorship and a ruthless form of repression called the Dirty War, but unemployment is high and the economy is suffering triple-digit inflation. General Galtieri and his inner circle can see the writing on the wall. The country could rise up against them, and a military regime on the brink of collapse can be more dangerous than ever. It will resort to violence, either against its own population or a foreign enemy to save its own skin. In many ways, capturing the Falkland Islands must seem like the perfect solution to Argentina's rulers, to resolve a long-standing grievance and rally a nation. And Galtieri even has reason to believe he'll get international support, despite his harsh rule and his ruthless tactics against his own population. Many Western countries, including the United States, consider him a strong ally in the global fight against communism. He is in some way the devil they know. Galtieri may even think the international community will persuade Margaret Thatcher not to put up a fight. Would the British Prime Minister dare wage a war thousands of miles away? A war that might be unpopular both at home and on the world stage? Just how far will the British go to stand up for the Falkland Islands? Before countries go to war, they often test the resolve of their enemy. They may fire shots across a border or briefly occupy a small piece of territory. If these limited incursions are met with unexpected resistance, plans for a full-scale invasion can be altered or even postponed. But once war plans start to solidify, they can take on a life of their own, especially in a dictatorship. A dictator's reputation and grip on power demands he carries through on promises he's made to his inner circle, the military propping him up. Once ships sail, it's harder to call them back, whether you're a hostile invading force or a distant navy suddenly called upon to defend national pride.
For years before war erupts over the Falkland Islands, Argentina is already in the middle of a war with its own people. This is a country where it's dangerous, even deadly, to speak out against the government, and those who do often disappear into thin air, never to be seen again. It's part of a campaign of fear introduced by a military dictatorship that seized power in 1976. Ruling with an iron fist for the last 5 years, the dictatorship is now led by General Leopold Galtieri. As commander of the Argentine army, Galtieri is a firm believer in the adage, power grows out of the barrel of a gun.
Galtieri was a military man. He looked at the world with the mindset of an Argentine military, and he began plotting with other hardliners in the armed forces, and their goal was to reassert the power and the strength of the military regime in Argentina.
Galtieri's inner circle includes Admiral Jorge Anaya, head of the Navy, and Lamy Doza, in charge of the Air Force. For these men, maintaining control is what matters most. That means silencing all opposition with a sinister form of repression, known as dirty war.
Dirty war is a technique used against subversive organizations. It consisted of lifting people, of capturing them, taking them to secret interrogation centers, and extracting everything from them. The word was processing them. It had a secondary effect as far as the military intelligence was concerned, was that it caused panic among the comrades of the person who'd been picked up, and the word was it disappeared, causing them to use the telephone, to break cover, to betray safe houses. So it had a multiplier effect against the subversive organizations.
People usually refer to this as a war, the dirty war as a war, but actually there was no war. This was state terrorism executed by the state against ordinary Argentine citizens.
One of the state's most effective weapons is Alfredo Estes, often referred to as the Blonde Angel of Death. Naval officer by day, ruthless plainclothes government agent by night.
Promotion in the Argentine Armed Forces corresponded to how well you performed during the dirty war. Classic example was the young naval officer called Alfredo Estes, who would infiltrate any group that was suspected of being subversive, identify who the leaders were, and then they would be disappeared. And he was a one-stop shopping center for counterterrorism. He did the infiltrating, identifying, he'd take part in the snatch, and then he'd do the torturing.
People start wondering what happened to that person in the family, in the community, in the workplace. And that's precisely what the military wanted, to impose fear on Argentine society.
Normally, you have bodies turning up all over the place. The chilling thing about the Argentines was that the bodies didn't show up. Most of them were taken on what was called Soljet, which is a tourist flight, except it was one way. They were flying them out over the Atlantic and dropping them in the ocean.
The terror tactic proves effective, but stokes anger against the regime from citizens and groups like the mothers of the disappeared.
Well, every week, the mothers of children who'd been snatched off the streets by the regime would congregate in the main square of Buenos Aires and hold up placards and shout, "Where are our children?"
Adding to Galtieri's problems, the Argentine economy is on the brink of collapse.
Galtieri and the military leaders not only had killed, scores of Argentine citizens, they had mismanaged totally the Argentine economy.
Holding on to power can require drastic measures or a major distraction. Late in 1981, Galtieri and Anaya come up with a possible solution: a military invasion, more power through the barrel of a gun. Anaya's proposed target? The Malvinas, or Falkland Islands, 290 miles off the coast of Argentina, the source of a long-standing and popular grievance. Argentines believe the islands were stolen from them by Great Britain 150 years earlier.
The British called the islands Falklands, but Argentines have never used that name. They call it Malvinas. They might be very little, but they are very huge in the Argentine mind. It's a widely shared belief that these islands have always been Argentine.
Despite the Argentine claim, the islands remain under British control. Administered by the well-liked Governor Rex Hunt, most of the 2,000 residents are British descendants, residents suspicious of Argentine intentions. Residents like Patrick Watts, a radio announcer living in the Falkland capital of Stanley.
I mean, the Argentine sort of claim to the Falklands had always been there, but it was a bit of a joke. They think it belongs to them. We don't, the British don't, so really we don't have to worry.
For a military dictatorship fighting for survival, taking back the islands will fulfill a national dream and rally a country behind their regime. Admiral Anaya believes they can snatch the islands without bloodshed, assuming the British, half a world away, won't put up a fight.
Admiral Anaya had been the Argentine naval attaché in London in the mid-1970s, and while here he'd formed a very low opinion of British resolve and determination.
The British give Anaya what he sees as proof of his low opinion when they decide to cut back on their once powerful navy, starting with the HMS Endurance, the one vessel that patrols the Falkland Islands. Anaya also knows many British officials are sympathetic to Argentine claims, or are at least willing to turn a blind eye.
British policy towards the Falkland Islands was entirely devised by the Foreign Office. One of the things they wanted to do to supposedly make life easier for themselves in all of Latin America was to get rid of the irritation, as they saw it, of the Falkland Islands. If you say that to a fascist regime, you might as well say, go ahead and invade, because we're not going to stop you.
The time is right. Great Britain appears to have lost interest in the South Atlantic. HMS Endurance is about to be decommissioned. London is a world away. Argentina is next door, and therefore the Falklands are ripe for the picking.
Galtieri, Anaya, and Lamidosa agree and begin planning their secret invasion of the Falkland Islands. They choose a date 4 months away. Immediately, they call up Army conscripts, mobilize Air Force pilots, and Anaya's Navy is readied for battle.
Anaya was going around saying the British won't fight. Of course, if he'd been alert, he'd have realized that there was a new sheriff in old London town called Margaret Thatcher.
Thatcher, Britain's first female prime minister, has earned the nickname the Iron Lady from the Soviet press.
She was a nationalist, she firmly believed in Great Britain. On the other hand, the economy was a little wobbly, inflation was high, and she had to get Great Britain back on the map where she believed it stood.
Argentina's military leaders have tested Britain's resolve before, with a smaller territorial claim, establishing a presence on the remote and inhospitable South Sandwich Island of Thule, also technically under British rule.
The Navy set up a base on southern Thule purely to test whether the British would react, whether they'd kick them off it.
Britain quietly protests, but stops short of using force to evict the Argentines. Now in the crosshairs, the island of South Georgia. A larger stepping stone to the main prize, the Falklands, just to the north. In charge of the plan, a man capable of almost anything. Argentine government assassin Alfredo Estes, the blonde angel of death. After waging a silent, dirty war inside his own country, he's now stalking a new victim, Great Britain itself.
A Royal Marine is arguably one of the best trained and most highly disciplined fighting men in the world. But with less than 80 Marines at their disposal, Governor Rex Hunt and Major Mike Norman face incredible odds defending the Falkland Islands against a hostile Argentine invasion. Major Norman's doing everything right in terms of troop disposition and defensive tactics. He's placed obstructions on the airstrip at Stanley to prevent Argentine jets from landing. He's evacuated the Royal Marine Barracks, assuming it will come under attack. And he's placed many of his men to cover what he thinks will be landing zones and Argentine points of attack. Vehicles are in place in case they need to make a hasty retreat. And Government House, the seat of British power on the islands, will be a key point of defense. But put yourself in Norman's shoes. With the arrival of an entire Argentine armada carrying thousands of troops, his efforts can at best only slow down the attack. There's no doubt that a devastating blow is about to hit the people of the Falkland Islands and the entire nation of Great Britain. But what about Argentina? As they approach, are they doing everything right? When a country launches an invasion, they make many calculations based on assumptions about the enemy, assumptions about troop strength and morale. General Galtieri's military regime has reason to believe they won't face resistance from the Falkland Islanders because they plan to overwhelm them with a much larger force. And they assume Britain won't respond from afar. In fact, they don't believe there will be a war at all, just a swift occupation. But morale is a hard thing to gauge. The morale of a soldier, an island, or a distant nation suddenly faced with a challenge to its national pride is a factor that can blow your plans right out of the water.
March 1982. For 3 months, Argentine dictator Leopoldo Galtieri and his inner circle have been planning an invasion of the coveted Malvinas, or Falkland Islands. The tentative attack date is still a few months away when they decide to make a short-term preliminary move against Great Britain and Margaret Thatcher. A test of nerve, a preamble to the full-scale invasion ahead. 900 miles southeast of the Falklands, 40 Argentines land on the remote British territory of South Georgia, claiming to be scrap metal workers hired by an Argentinian merchant. The group is led by Argentina's most trusted agent of terror, Alfredo Estes, the blonde angel of death. In a bold move, they don military uniforms and raise the Argentine flag. An act of aggression that quickly gets the attention of Prime Minister Thatcher in London. Betting the Argentines will back down, Thatcher sends the HMS Endurance, the one British vessel patrolling the Falklands region, straight for South Georgia. The Argentine flag comes down, but the men refuse to leave. Instead of being intimidated, General Galtieri and his inner circle in Argentina grow more confident in their plan. Projecting confidence is critical if their plan to distract a nation is to be successful.
People are angry about the political and economic situation of the country. There are riots, cars are burned, and people are killed.
Afraid time is running out on their regime, Galtieri and Anaya realize it's time for desperate measures. They move up their full-scale invasion of the Falklands by almost 2 months.
In order to defuse the situation, the military leaders decided to go ahead and invade the Malvinas Islands on April 2, 1982.
Nationalism needs an external enemy. Hitler had the Danzig corridor. The Argentines, for a very long time, had the Falklands. It was something to rouse the masses, to get them saying hurrah for Argentina and not think about how they were being governed, which was invariably badly.
The military's plan, codenamed Operation Rosario, is a surprise attack on the Falklands, involving both amphibious and airborne landings. On March 28th, over 3,000 soldiers set off on maneuvers in the South Atlantic. Their real goal? Take the Malvinas.
It was supposed to be a quick action, by surprise. In order to occupy the islands, the Argentine military leaders believed that Great Britain would not react, would not dare to go to the islands. It was too far, too costly, and too risky.
In London, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher is shocked by the sudden escalation, the size, and clearly hostile intent of the Argentine force. Hoping diplomatic pressure can save the Falklands before it's too late, she turns to a powerful and persuasive ally, American President Ronald Reagan, asking him to intervene and warn the Argentines off. Reagan contacts Galtieri directly and tries to talk him out of the invasion. Regardless of how persuasive Reagan is, Galtieri refuses all his appeals. Backing down will bring his regime to an end. While Thatcher tries diplomacy, residents on the Falkland Islands are unaware of the approaching danger. In the small capital city of Stanley, Governor Rex Hunt first learns the news in an urgent cable from London.
The telegram said that an Argentinian invasion force was making its way to the Falklands, and of course with the famous last line, "Make your dispositions accordingly."
With British forces an ocean away and their fate seemingly in their own hands, Rex Hunt shares the grim news with the new commander of the Falkland Royal Marines, Major Mike Norman. On the job for 3 days, Norman has less than 80 men to defend against a full-scale Argentine invasion.
Major Mike Norman decided to abandon the barracks where the Royal Marines were stationed, put some of his men on the beaches where he expected the Argentinians to land, and the remainder were left to guard Government House.
Norman's troops hunker down as the Argentine Armada approaches. At the radio station, local islander Patrick Watts prepares for the most challenging shift of his career.
The governor told me that an invasion by Argentine forces was imminent, and he told me keep the radio station on the air for as long as possible, and I knew what he meant until the Argentines came in and took it over. When we realized that all attempts to stop the Argentinians invading had failed, then I became quite afraid. I had all my family there, my 2 children, my mother, friends, relatives, all living in the Falklands. We didn't know what was going to happen, how the Argentines would come in. Would they survive or not? And then around about 2 o'clock in the morning, when we knew that the invasion would take place, I told all my staff members, you've got to go home. I've got to stay. I have no choice.
Across the islands, residents wait in fear, preparing for the worst.
And I think most of them just stayed up all night, drinking tea and coffee, staying awake, listening to the radio, because it kept them in touch with what was going on.
April 2nd, 1982. After making the 290-mile trip from Argentina aboard a massive invasion fleet, Argentine helicopters materialize, descending on the hills just beyond Stanley. Their mission? Capture the capital city and realize a national dream.
I decided to just appeal to the people to tell me what they could see and what they could hear. And suddenly I had all these telephone calls coming in. People got involved, and I was relaying all this information to the rest of the islands and the rest of the world, in effect.
Calls flood in from islanders, confirming Patrick Watt's greatest fear. Argentine forces are pouring onto the island. Though the small Royal Marine Force puts up a spirited defense, the much larger Argentine force swiftly captures the islands, leaving Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, a choice. Accept the unacceptable or attempt the impossible.
When Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, or the Malvinas as they called them, they were convinced that Britain would never respond militarily over such a great distance. So Galtieri and his regime in Buenos Aires are surprised to learn a massive task force is heading their way. A task force made up of over 100 ships. For Galtieri, it's far too late to withdraw. Argentine forces are already on the islands. He's begun to fulfill the long-held dream of a nation. And as his regime hoped, the entire country of Argentina has rallied around the military gamble. The corruption and repression of his government is no longer in the public spotlight. Galtieri knows that backing down in the face of British pressure will finish him and bring down his government. For her part, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher could have accepted the invasion as a fait accompli, as a redress for an old grievance, as no doubt many felt she should. Instead, she chooses to take a big risk and respond with force. And that means sending British forces on a dangerous mission thousands of miles from home. When military conflict looms, countries like Great Britain normally have what we call contingency plans. If such and such happens, our armed forces can respond in this or that particular way. But sometimes a situation arises for which there is no plan, a war considered unlikely ever to happen or simply impossible to win. Great Britain found itself rushing toward just such a war, a race against time to carry out a counter-invasion most at the time thought was militarily impossible.
April 1982. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the quickly assembled British task force prepare to make the 8,000-mile journey to the Falkland Islands. Their route first takes them 4,000 miles south to Ascension Island, the last and only piece of solid land between Britain and the Falkland Islands.
The Falkland Islands is 1/3 the way round the world from the UK, 8,000 miles. So everything you need, every bean, every bullet, every pint of fuel, you've got to take with you or have taken out to you. And we had no airfields near the Falklands because the only ones were held by the enemy, by the Argentines. The nearest one was 4,000 miles away at Ascension Island.
As British forces sail south, the Argentine occupiers of the Falklands spread across the entire island. Within days, the villages of Goose Green and Darwin are seized. Residents are subjected to constant air and foot patrols, new laws, and an ever-present possibility of arrest.
Having originally said that nothing was going to change, we soon suddenly found ourselves driving on the right. Spanish was introduced to the schools. Argentine pesos became legal currency. One night I ran slap bang into a patrol, and it was manos arribas, hands up. It just became too dangerous.
As a population is held captive, and Argentina and Great Britain prepare to face off in the South Atlantic, the crisis attracts international attention. U.S. President Ronald Reagan sends Secretary of State Alexander Haig on a peacekeeping mission to both London and Buenos Aires.
He tried to devise an agreement by which, Argentina, the United States, and Great Britain would share authority in the island until the question of sovereignty could be resolved. And of course, it couldn't go nowhere because Great Britain had made clear they wanted a resolution basically by either forcing the Argentine out through negotiations or by war. And the Argentine military were trapped. They have already occupied the island and they couldn't go back now.
war is inevitable. On April 10th, the first ships of the Royal Naval Task Force reach the midway point of their journey, Ascension Island. On the island's airbase, the Royal Air Force prepare their aircraft to support the counterattack on the Falklands, 4,000 miles away.
The task force was a power projection instrument. It was divided into a battle group centered on 2 aircraft carriers and an amphibious task group centered around 2 amphibious assault ships. Now, protecting these vital ships were a selection of escorts. If the British lost the carriers, or perhaps even more importantly, the amphibious assault ships, then the British had pretty much lost any ability to retake the Falklands.
Operating from the aircraft carriers are 34 British Harrier jet fighters, armed with American-made Sidewinder missiles.
The Sidewinder missile was basically the most sophisticated heat-seeking air-to-air missile available at the time. It permitted a pilot to fire the missile at an aircraft from pretty much any direction with a reasonable chance of hitting it.
Knowing the British are closing in, Galtieri and the Argentines ready their own firepower. They boast around 100 combat-ready aircraft, including 4 Super Étendards, capable of firing Exocet missiles. The Exocet can deliver a high-speed attack at a very low altitude, making it a significant threat to the approaching British Navy. As the British task force closes in on the Falkland Islands, battle plans take shape. Codenamed Operation Corporate, the plan includes a naval blockade by task force destroyers to provide safe passage for ground forces to land at San Carlos. When the ships land, British troops and equipment can be deployed under cover of night.
We chose San Carlos because it was an almost landlocked, and that meant it was protected from the weather, which was its principal benefit, because it meant that we would be able to land whatever the weather was doing outside. And we wanted to get our people ashore as quickly as possible, starting after midnight, to make certain we had enough guys ashore to protect it in case they came and attacked us when they discovered we were there.
Before the British counterattack is launched, a smaller element of the task force breaks away to the south to execute a preliminary strike on South Georgia, the site of Argentina's initial invasion, led by government assassin Alfredo Estes.
He set up a number of booby traps around the place he was defending to catch us when we were landing there to take it. Fortunately, he was captured and was made to disarm them.
In the retaking of South Georgia, the British were ultimately able to get the Argentinian garrison to surrender without a fight.
The recapture of South Georgia boosts the morale of Royal Marines and British citizens back home. The Falklands will be a much bigger and more dangerous challenge. On April 30th, as they get ready to close in, Britain declares a 200-mile total exclusion zone around the islands, warning the Argentines that any ship inside the zone will be attacked. Showing their ability to strike from distance, a British Vulcan bomber flies an 8,000-mile sortie, refueling in flight to bomb the Falklands' only airstrip at Stanley, and eliminating the ability of Argentine fast jets to land there.
On the 1st of May, I was awakened by the sound of a terrible noise going on, and I wasn't sure where it was. But when I looked out, I discovered that Stanley Airport had been attacked. British Vulcan bombers had come all the way from Ascension Island and had attacked the airport. The Argentinians just couldn't believe that it had happened. It really shocked them.
The attack at Stanley leads to a series of airstrikes on both sides. 2 Argentine cruisers, the 25th of May from the north and the Belgrano from the south, are soon edging along the exclusion zone on both sides of the task force. The maneuvers seem like a preamble to a coordinated strike.
Admiral Woodward, commanding the carriers, realizing the Argentines were mounting a pincer attack on him.
Tensions grow as the commander prepares to make an unorthodox move that will turn a game of cat and mouse on the high seas into full-scale war.
In early Early May 1982, full-scale war in the South Atlantic seems inevitable. As for manpower, British troops enlisted to serve. They're well-trained and motivated. They know they're getting ready for the fight of their lives. On the other hand, Argentine soldiers are a conscript force, ordered to fight, and they've received less training. But they do hold the advantage of possessing the disputed territory. The British are faced not only with the challenge of pushing out an occupying force. First, they need to eliminate the clear and present danger to their task force, the circling Argentine Navy. In war, a clear chain of command and good communications are vital for success. But sometimes a commander needs to make a decision on the battlefield, a decision he or she may not have the proper authority to make. For the British Navy engaged during the Falklands War, proper authority is thousands of miles away, and their communication lines are suspect. What's a commander caught in a double bind between military necessity and proper protocol to do? A decision, right or wrong, will dramatically alter the course of the war. These are the moments true leaders are born.
May 2nd, 1982. The British mission to reclaim the occupied Falkland Islands from Argentina is facing a potential crisis. After traveling thousands of miles, task force ships carrying the Royal Marines are trapped at sea, and 2 Argentine destroyers are threatening a pincer move that could fire on the fleet. British Admiral John Woodward has to act. He needs one of the British submarines in the area to strike the Argentine destroyer Belgrano. It's an order he lacks the authority to give.
Command of the submarines in his area was vested back in the UK, so he couldn't order the submarines to attack the task force approaching him.
Time is fast running out, and contacting Naval Command through normal channels could waste critical minutes. So Woodward improvises. He gives the order to attack, an order he knows can't be followed, an obvious breach of the chain of command.
So he sent a signal to the nuclear submarines saying sink them, but he copied the signal to the UK. And the guys in the UK looked at the signal and said, hey, he's not meant to be doing this.
There's no way that this order can be followed, but its very provocative nature was bound to get the attention of his superiors, who would then act quickly to assess the situation and grant him the authority he needed to attack the Belgrano before it attacked him.
They took it to Chequers, which was the Prime Minister's country retreat, where she was having a meeting with various senior commanders, showed her the signal. She said, yes, go ahead, do it.
With his unorthodox order quickly confirmed, Woodward contacts the nuclear submarine Conqueror. May 2nd, 3:55 p.m. 3 successive torpedoes are launched, heading directly for the Belgrano. 20 minutes later, the captain of the Belgrano orders his crew to abandon ship. The vessel sinks quickly, and 323 men are killed in the attack.
By sinking the Belgrano, the British were sending a clear signal to everyone that they were not going back, that war was the only solution.
Retaliation from Argentina is swift and deadly. 2 days after the sinking of the Belgrano, an Argentine jet targets the British destroyer Sheffield, crippling the ship and killing 20 sailors. War in the Falklands is on. Britain loses a ship, but the Argentine Navy retreats, leaving the British a clear path for a full-scale assault. On May 21st, the British initiate amphibious landings in the remote and sheltered inlet of San Carlos.
Had the Argentinians done the same level of analysis as the British, they would also have concluded that San Carlos was the most likely landing spot. However, because of their preoccupation with defending Port Stanley against a possible landing, the British were able to take them by surprise.
The surprise is soon lost. The British are still deploying their troops onto the beach when a lone Argentine jet flies over the hill on a routine patrol. The task force is caught in broad daylight, trapped, without air cover.
It was surreal. He flew down the anchorage, guns firing from both sides, and away he went. But it certainly gave us a foretaste of what was going to happen over the next 10 days.
Once we'd landed at San Carlos, that wasn't the end of the operation, it was merely the beginning. What we had to do now was advance on Stanley, which was the strategic aim, take the place and bring the whole thing to an end.
Argentine air assaults continue against the advancing forces, costing dozens of British lives. On the ground, a different story plays out for the undertrained Argentine conscripts.
So they were not professional soldiers, and they found themselves fighting against one of the most modern military machines in the middle of horrible weather conditions.
On June 14th, Stanley returns to British rule. After several weeks of close combat on land, in what stands as the last great naval battle, the Falklands War is over. 255 British servicemen lose their lives retaking the islands. For Argentina, the human cost, 649.
The Falklands campaign certainly tested Great Britain. But we were fortunate to have a Prime Minister like Margaret Thatcher, who was prepared to stand up and say, you don't mess around with Great Britain.
Galtieri and his military regime in Argentina expected a simple conquest, an occupation, not a war. Back home, the population feels betrayed by the propaganda and folly of this harsh dictatorship.
They're shocked because they're completely uninformed what had been going on, because of the tight control of the press by the military, broadcasting their own message to Argentine society about how good the war was going on. They couldn't hide the reality that the war was lost. And all the conflicts that had been going on before the war now reappeared. Basically, it was the last nail in the coffin for the military.
Galtieri's dictatorship soon collapses, and a new kind of freedom sets in on Argentina. The Falkland Islands remain British, but protest from Argentina continues to this day.
The 1982 conflict certainly put the Falklands on the map. For us, it changed many things as well, because before the war, Britain always said, we listen to what you say, but we don't necessarily do what you want. But after the war, of course, everything changed.
It's always a shame, though, to go to war. But if politicians and diplomats are unable to solve the problem, inevitably they will turn to soldiers, sailors and airmen anywhere in the world, and it is then down to them to solve that issue.
Not many people expected the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher, to respond so defiantly to the invasion of the Falklands. Certainly, Galtieri and his dictatorship were caught off guard. And despite the belief that the Malvinas belonged to them, many of the Argentine soldiers were simply not well trained and not motivated to fight. Compare that to the character of the Royal Marine, highly disciplined, strategically savvy, and perhaps endowed with a better sense of brotherhood and purpose. Many people thought a British counterinvasion was a military impossibility, but Prime Minister Thatcher and her commanders showed that sometimes, when there's a will and national pride and principle at stake, there can also be a way.